Good, so we'll continue our lesson here on surveying a population just with one more piece right here, and that is looking at different types of bias. Now, bias is going to be when your survey results do not reflect the population. That is, when all of the effort that you have put into to collect your survey is put a little bit to waste because it's not going to give us an accurate representation of what we're trying to represent, which is that population. Now, sample selection bias is when our sample does not reflect the population. These might sound exactly the same. There are some slight differences, but really, this is when the group that we have selected is not very good or is not representing the population, either because not all groups are represented or because maybe there was a conflict in selecting those for the sample. Non-response bias might sound really similar. It's when the respondents are different, when they differ from our non-respondents. Now, our real focus here, the difference is going to be non-response bias when our respondents are different. We're going to use that when we're describing somewhere where we do not necessarily select or when the survey organizers do not select the population. So say something like a voluntary response sample, which is one of the techniques we spoke about in the previous lesson, or when we're talking about a convenience sample, right, where we're not necessarily choosing which individuals are coming to respond, but if there's a difference between those selected for the sample and those who did not respond but who are in our population, that's when we have ourselves some non-response bias. A loaded question is when the questions push or suggest a certain response from a recipient. An example would be something like, hey, have you stopped littering? The issue with a question like this is if you go up to somebody and you ask that question is whether they say yes or they say no, they're acknowledging that they used to be littering before. This is a loaded question because just by answering it, whoever is sitting there responding can feel put into a trap, right? Can feel like everything, like the question itself is against them. It's not a fair question to ask, and it's something that can skew, it can affect the results of a survey. Right? Another example would be smoking kills. Do you think smoking should be allowed in public? Now, if we are looking for a non-biased response from folks, then this piece right at the start, the smoking kills, this is going to push a certain idea to somebody else, right? If we're trying to take the bias out of this, I would remove that from the question and we'd be working with, do you think smoking should be allowed in public? Right, where we're not trying to push a certain answer from our respondents. What type of bias is demonstrated in each scenario? Let's look at each of these. I encourage you to pause the video here, try them out yourself. Try to recognize which types of bias are present right here, and then unpause the video, double check, see how we're doing here, because I imagine this is a little bit uncomfortable for your math brain. It might be beneficial to try it, come back, and then see the logic that we're looking at. A poll is conducted that asks students if they think the school should do more to help the environment. Any students participating in the poll should drop off their survey at the front office. After the results are tallied, 92% of students are in favor of the school doing more to help the environment. Well, let's look at our survey strategies. That is, this is either a simple random sample, a stratified sample, a voluntary response sample, or a convenience sample. Now, when we're working right here, we recognize that in this situation we're talking about, volunteers are coming to give their inputs whether the school should be doing more to help the environment. They are volunteering to come by I believe it's the front office. Yeah, they're volunteering to come by the front office. Well, if that's the case, if it's a voluntary response sample, as we spoke about in the previous part of the lesson, then we're expecting those to show up who really, really are the most passionate students. Because of that, they're not necessarily going to reflect the population itself. Right? I'll say that again. If a student does not care whether the school does more or does less to help the environment, they're not going to be the ones who show up at the front office. Right? 92% of the students are in favor of the school doing more to help the environment. That's great. The issue is really it's 92% of the respondents are in favor of the school doing more to help the environment, and as we spoke about, those respondents are not necessarily reflected. So, is it a loaded question here? No, the issue is not with the wording of the question. Is this some non-response bias where the respondents are different from non-respondents? Absolutely. We're working here with some non-response bias. All right, let's look a little bit further. A newspaper poll reads, do you favor the proposed bylaw in which the government will dictate whether you have the right to smoke in a restaurant? Again, it seems like our topic seems to be smoking in this particular lesson, but that's all right. Do you favor the proposed bylaw in which case the government will dictate whether you have the right to smoke in a restaurant? That is, the wording of this is very strong, and it pushes forward the idea of control, of someone else controlling you. Well, you know what? That's what laws are a little bit, right? Laws are some rules so a society can get all along, can be there to benefit every individual is the intention of laws, right? So if we're talking about proposed bylaw, really a non-biased way to ask this question would be, do you favor the proposed bylaw where smoking will not be allowed in restaurants? But here, with the use of strong wording, dictate, and the right to smoke in a restaurant, with these strong wordings, this loads the question up a little bit. It suggests the idea. It pushes folks to respond and say, no, I do not agree with this bylaw. I think they should not tell us whether we can smoke or not in restaurants. This has a loaded question. The SAA asks spectators at a basketball game if the school should spend money on new basketball uniforms. Okay, well, who is the sample that we're asking? Oh, well, that's going to be spectators at a basketball game, right? And who are the population that they're representing? Oh, the entire school. Okay, so now we ask ourselves, do we think the spectators at the basketball game will have different answers than the rest of the school if the question we're asking is whether we should spend new money on basketball uniforms? I would say absolutely. Those folks who care most about basketball are going to be the ones at the basketball game. They're more passionate about this, right? Because they differ in that way, they are more likely to say, yes, we should spend more money on new basketball uniforms, and those who don't care about basketball are not going to have the opportunity to respond, right? So in this case, we're working with some sample selection bias. There's an issue with how we conducted our sample. If you're feeling comfortable right here, you should be able to recognize and describe the different types of bias. Nice work.